the way I write a novel is so much more, it feels a little woo-woo in the same vein as mediumship or something, where like these characters do their own thing. And I'm always really surprised by what they do. I know I'm the one controlling them. I know I'm the one creating them. And yet I am often like, oh, I didn't know that person, knew that person, or, oh, or just a little side character suddenly announces themselves as, no, I'm actually going to be a main character. And it's like, oh, you are? All right, fine.
They
That has,
talk to you. They sounds like the characters in a way, as they develop, they kind of speak to you.
yeah, it's weird, but yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Marilyn Schairer from the GBH Newsroom. You may know me from my work as a reporter with WGBH News, but tonight I am thrilled to be hosting GBH's Beyond the Page with best-selling author Courtney Sullivan. She is the best-selling author of the novels Commencement, Maine, The Engagements, Saints for All Occasions, and Friends and Strangers. Now, her work has been translated into 17 languages, and her writing has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, the Washington Post, and the Chicago Tribune, among many others. She lives in Massachusetts with her husband and 2 children, and her latest novel, The Cliffs, was the July 2024 selection for Reese Witherspoon's book club. Isn't that great? A lot of fun. So tonight we have the privilege of delving into into this world of literacy, gaining exclusive insights and a sneak peek into The Cliffs. There'll be no spoilers here, but now, without further delay, please welcome to Beyond the Page, Courtney Sullivan. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Marilyn. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's so good to see you.
You too, and welcome, welcome. We're all very excited to be here to learn more about your writing, your techniques, your insights, your influences, so many questions that people rarely get an opportunity to talk with authors. So I really think it's going to be a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Yes, yes. So let's talk a little bit, if we can, Courtney. So many people, just in addition to being an avid reader and love to read, so many people want to learn how to write. And I think that's a question you probably have heard, you had to answer before, but since we're all here gathered tonight, talk about how you first got published, if you can.
I have always loved, loved, loved writing. I first started as a reader, as I think most writers do. And it was that love of reading other people's books that made me think, oh, maybe I'll try to write a story. And when I was a little kid, my favorite thing in the world was to write a story or a play or a poem. And if it was a play, then I was making the whole neighborhood perform it. And, it was just what I always loved to do. When I went to college, I went to Smith College in Western Mass, and I wanted to be a writer, but I really didn't know, like, what is the path? And um, every time a published writer would come to campus, I would go hear them speak, and then I would ask them, what did you do? How did you get to be where you are? And I think there are a lot of different paths that writers take to that particular position. At that time, a lot of the people I spoke to said, I worked in magazines. Now, this was the early 2000s, so magazines were a little different than they had been when a lot of these people were working in magazines in their heyday 20 or 30 years earlier. But nonetheless, I'm very obedient. So I said, okay, I'll work in magazines. So I got a job at a women's magazine in New York, and I was there for 2 years. And then I moved on to being a research assistant at the New York Times for a couple of the opinion columnists there. But all the while I was working on my first published novel. I think a lot of writers will say my first published novel, because of course there are a couple in a drawer that will never see the light of day. And that's all part of the process. So this is a very Boston story, because I'm from the Boston area. I'm from Milton. And my college internship was at the Atlantic Monthly when it was
Wow,
in Boston. Yeah.
that's impressive.
Yes, and I got to work with Michael Curtis, the fiction editor there, which was amazing. And he was very kind to me, and read some of my stories and said, keep sending us things. And so one of the editors there, Lucy Prince, who had actually hired me and was this amazing mentor to so many of us interns, she ended up reading one of my stories and said, I'd love to share this with an agent who's just starting her career. She also was an intern at The Atlantic just before me, and she was brand new to agenting. So her name was Brittany Bloom, and she's still my agent to this day. We've been together since I was 20 and she was probably 25.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, so it's a crazy, I mean, it's such a lucky story and such a I feel like sometimes people ask me, how do you get an agent? And I'm like, I don't know, because my story is so bizarre and specific. But I think the most important thing is like to do the work,
Mhm.
um, I always liken it to, I used to live in New York. Now I'm back in Massachusetts, but I lived in New York for 20 years. And my husband and I lived in this apartment where the New York City Marathon went right by our apartment. And so once a year, on that wonderful day of days, I was like, I want to be a marathon runner. I am going to run a marathon. But the fact is, I never even run a mile. So that's not really going to happen. And I think we all choose where to put our time and our passion and we all have a limited amount of free time. So I think the first question, if someone says, I want to be a writer or I want to write a book, it's, are you writing? Because that's just has to be the first piece of it.
Mhm, mhm. And by reading other people's work, did that make you a better writer?
Oh, for sure. And I feel like it's still the case. I try to read books that make me a little jealous, I guess I would say, because I know, oh my gosh, I wish I could write this. I feel like it's sort of like an athlete needs a certain kind of diet for fuel, like an author needs to be reading a certain quality of book to keep them going.
That's good. I have so many other questions, but we do have a lot of questions already lined up. So let's just like open it up to some of the questions. The first one, I'll go with the first one. This is from Carol Radford. She says, Hi, Courtney. I have read several of your books and love your characters. What was your motivation for writing this latest book? From Carol and Dave Radford. And Richard Radford is Dave's brother.
I was just going to say, I know Richard Radford.
There you go.
Oh, that's wonderful. Oh, hi. Oh, I know who you are. Okay. So well, thanks for being here. And also, the inspiration for this particular book, and now this is my sixth novel, so I'm starting to notice the patterns of how it works. And for me, usually the sort of germ or the seed of an idea for a book is planted many years before I actually start writing that story. But I sort of know that there's something to it, and it might not be the time for whatever reason to write it now, but I will sort of put it in my pocket and know that at some point that story is coming back to me. And so in this case, it was about 12 years ago, my husband and I and two of our friends were in Agunquit, Maine. We were on vacation, which is our happy place. We go there every summer. I've gone there every summer of my life. And we came upon this house on a cliff in Cape Nettic when we were out driving one day. It was beautiful, a beautiful old house, the most amazing piece of land. I mean, just this rolling lawn down to the cliff and the ocean. And the house was fully furnished, but it was abandoned. And we were so curious about this. And, as lovers of Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys and R.L. Stine and all of that, I mean, who doesn't love an abandoned house, of course, right? And wondering, as a writer, immediately story comes into your head and you're wondering, who lived here and where did they go and why did they leave and what do all these objects in the house mean? What does it mean that, for example, there was a dollhouse in the house? Does that mean that there was a child here? What does it mean? Why did the banister cave in from the second floor to the first? Probably just because the house is falling apart, but in the eyes of a novelist, that was probably some sort of tragedy. There's some sort of story there. And so um, we would go back and visit this house every summer. And after a few years, we came upon the property expecting to see the house, and it was gone. It had been torn down, and in its place was the foundation for a very, very large house that was about to be built. And we were just so crushed by this, even though we felt like it was ridiculous to be crushed because it was never ours, really. So I went home at that point and started writing about the house. I wrote what was in all the rooms of the house and what it looked like. And then it was actually a few years after that that the characters came to me about 4 years ago, right at the start of COVID. And for various reasons, these characters all kind of came to me. And I saw the house as this wonderful kind of vessel for telling all of their stories.
Wow, that sounds really intriguing. We have a question that's about 18 people are giving thumbs up, so I'm going to ask you this one. You mentioned R.L. Stine and Nancy Drew, but they're asking, Shannon McIntosh actually put the question in, what authors do you like to read?
Oh my goodness. So, I mean, so many. And all the time I'm discovering more. I think all of us here who love books know that it can be really overwhelming sometimes. Sometimes I walk into a bookstore and I feel like it's a candy store and I'm so excited. And other times I'm like, oh gosh, I don't know where to start. There's just too many books. So I will say the author Ann Napolitano is one of my best friends, but also one of my favorite writers, which is very strange, but true. And her book, Hello Beautiful, is one of my recent favorites. I think a similar writer to Anne is Elizabeth Strout, and I'm so excited to read her new one, which just came out last week. But I've been reading, I just read a novel, a Laurie Colwin novel that was written in, I think, 1982. And it was so wonderful. And it also made me think that I went and looked. So as soon as I finish a novel, then I go and Google everything about, the author and the book and how did this come to be. And and I'm reading the reviews from the time that the book was written, and they're so dismissive, and I think later on, Laurie Colwin came to have this reputation for being this excellent writer and this wonderful creator of characters. And it's so frustrating sometimes to read, how was an author received in their moment. But of course, we're all products of our moment in a different, in different ways. I would say one of the books I recently read, The Wedding People, which is such a delightful read. And I loved it. And then I also recently read The Bee Sting, which couldn't be more opposite from The Wedding People. I also loved it. But I felt like I needed to sort of, I was very happy that my book club read it because I needed to process it with many people. And I actually gave it to many people, a few of whom were like, why did you give me this? And I'm like, I think I just gave it to you because I needed to talk to you about it.
That's a good way, sharing and discussing. That's what the basis of the foundation of all book clubs. Let's go to another question. There's a lot of people giving the thumbs up. This is from Rhonda Sussman, and she'd like to know, what is your connection to Maine? Did you spend time there as a child or as an adult? You mentioned that you go to Algonquin, so I don't know whether it goes deeper than that.
Yeah. So my mom always loved that area, Gunquit. And that was her happy place. And she made it ours as well. So we used to go every summer and rent a different cottage every year. And, we'd go for a week. And that's always been my favorite place. And my best friend from high school, Lauren, who's still my best friend to this day, her family had a home in Kittery Point, so not too far from Ogunquit. And so at every sort of stage of my life, I've spent a lot of time in southern Maine, first with my family of origin, and then with my best friend going to her family's home in the summertime. And now, in recent years with my own husband and our two kids, and everyone involved loves Maine to an equal level. So I enjoy that. And we've rented the same little cottage for about 15 years now.
So a long time. Yes. Another question from Virginia Pie, who there's a lot of thumbs up on that, over a dozen, says, what a terrific novel. I enjoyed and admired much about it, but I'm curious how you felt about writing a story that tells in part a Native American story when I don't believe, she says, that's your background. Did you face any pushback from your publisher?
Good question. Well, I wanted to write a novel about the sort of true story, the history of this place, the history of, I would say, the women who've lived in a house and the land on which that house sits over 400 years. And I came back to New England, moved back to New England in the summer of 2020. And one of the things I noticed was, every morning I'm walking with my dog along the Neponset River. And my son was in preschool at the time. And so he was, learning about, as I did back in the day, the first Thanksgiving. And I'm just thinking to myself, what stories have we been told about the origins of this place? And are they true? And what's been left out? So, this house in the book, it has a plaque on the side of it with a man's name on the plaque. And so does my house. My house was built in the 1890s. And it also has a man's name on the front of it. And so every morning I walk by that plaque and I think, but was he really the first? He wasn't the first person here. He was the first person to, pay for a house to be built here. But, I think in New England, we are so obsessed with this notion of first. So here I live in Milton, Mass. In Milton, we have the beautiful Blue Hills. If you go to the top of the Blue Hills, there's a weather observatory, and on it is a plaque that says America's first weather observatory. And every time I go there, I think to myself, but there was 10,000 years of indigenous life here before the colonists arrived. And I feel like the indigenous people were observing weather. That was part of what they were doing. So it's kind of, just because we call something the first doesn't mean it's the first. So I wanted to tell this more complicated story of the history of this place. And I felt like it was impossible and not right to tell that story without including indigenous people. And so, but of course, the question is totally valid because there's been a huge conversation within publishing in recent years about who is allowed to tell what story. And the conclusion I came to with this book was that it really would be wrong to not include that, but that if I am going to write about people I am not part of personally, it has to be done with a tremendous amount of research and a tremendous amount of consultation with that population. So I was very lucky to work with Donna Loring, who is a Penobscot tribal elder. She helped me tremendously with this book. And then we ended up becoming very good friends and going to the psychic medium camp in Maine, which I'm sure we'll talk about together. But Donna was a tremendous help. I did so much reading to sort of even know what the right questions were to ask. Mm-hmm. And I also did a lot of work at the Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor, which is it's the Museum of Wabanaki History and Culture. And so it was always a question of going back to the source and saying, is this respectful? Was this done well? Was this done right? I also had a professional, my friend Donna is a politician and an activist. So this isn't something she's done before. But I also worked with a professional, what's called sensitivity reader or a historical consultant who had worked on a lot of nonfiction books. So this is an Indigenous woman who lives in Canada, and she'd consulted on Killers of the Flower Moon and a lot of really prominent nonfiction books. But, she wasn't from Maine. So I wanted to make sure I also was speaking to people from that particular place. But she gave me feedback. So for example, she said at one point, I had seen in a documentary how the Wabanaki people would know just when it was the right time of year to strip the bark from a birch tree to then turn that into a birch bark canoe. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. I saw it in a documentary. So I put that as a detail in the book. And when this historical consultant read the book, that was one of several things where she said, that is not your information to share. Just because you saw it, it's not your information to share.
Really?
And
wow,
that's fascinating to me because especially my background, the job I had before this was researcher. That was my title. And so I've always been of the mindset, as are many of the archives where I've done research, like the more information, the better. But that is not always the case. in this particular culture. And so what I learned was, you've asked for this person's opinion, now listen to it and try to understand where it came from. So, I mean, it was done in heavy consultation with these women, and I listened to everything they said.
I bet that's a challenge. I know even as a reporter, you do get a lot of information coming in and you have to kind of sift through it and let your editors help you say, well, you really don't need that. And it's hard to sometimes let it go, but you have to listen, right? That's great. Okay, so we are going to go to one question. It's an anonymous question, did not put their name, but she writes, or he writes, you are a new author for me. Is there a book that I should begin with or just start with your first book?
Oh, well, thank you for the question. Uh, I don't know. It's so my first novel came out when I was 28. So now I think, oh my gosh, don't read that one. But I say that, but you know,
Right.
it's the first. So I don't know.
You've evolved. You've evolved as a writer since then.
I hope so. I feel like being a writer is so wonderful because hopefully you get better with age. You know, there's certain jobs where I'm glad I didn't become a gymnast or something, you know, where you kind of peak at whatever, 20. Because I feel like the older I get, the more I just know about life and the more stories there are that I feel like I can tell. And I think you sort of get new tools in your toolbox as a writer as you go too. I don't know if you want something that's a bit sad, I would start with Saints for All Occasions. And if you want something that's not quite as sad, I would start with Maine.
Let's go to Rhonda Sussman. She has a question that more about a dozen people also have or want you to answer. The Cliffs centers around a character who has an alcoholic mother and descends into alcoholism herself. What research or experience upon to write this about this character or these characters?
So I'm 8 years sober. So I did not need a sensitivity reader to write Jane. I've written in a lot of my books about generational alcoholism, about the sort of cycles of drinking in a family. And I think I've often written a central character or a kind of grounding character who is surrounded by relatives with various levels of alcoholism, but that person is very steady. And this time I thought, well, I want to be a little more honest, I guess, and tell the story of how sometimes somebody very high functioning, somebody, you know, who comes across as a sort of quote unquote good girl can also be an alcoholic too, you know? And so Jane is wrestling with, I'm not like my family because look at me, I have this job, I have this husband, I have this apartment. And what she has to own over the course of the book is that this is something that has affected every generation in her family. And, you know, it was important to me that Jane views her grandmother as this sort of perfect, saintly woman who never wrestled with any sort of problems, including addiction, because I think, you know, when we come into the world, we meet our family and we tend to receive them just as they are when we met them and not think necessarily, oh, I wonder if my grandmother, you know, had a past prior to being my grandmother, which of course we all do and did. So Jane, her, you know, her interest, her life's work is to uncover the stories of women's lives. And yet she hasn't really done that work in her own family until this whole incident happens and the story of this novel comes into her life.
Maybe can I ask you this real quick question from KMC, K and initials MC. She said, I listened to the Cliffs audiobook and loved all the different narrators for each of the characters' voices. Do you have any input into choosing the narrator?
So I love that comment. Thank you. I've never listened to any of my own books on audio because I just think that would be just mortifying. I can't imagine doing it. But this is the first time that I've been tempted to do it because each of the characters has their own narrator. And my kids are 5 and 7. I am often listening to audiobooks. I love audiobooks. And that's one of the ways that I manage to still read a lot of novels is by listening to them while I'm driving my kids around or I'm cleaning the house or making dinner or whatever. So when they presented me with a list of names of these are the people we think we will approach, I was like starstruck. They were all they were all narrators, readers who I recognized and who I was just like starstruck by. Marilyn in particular, the character Marilyn, is read by Kimberly Farr, who for me is Olive Kittredge. She does all the Elizabeth Strout books. And so I was just like, I couldn't believe it when they told me that. I was like, do you think she would do it? And they're like, yeah, it's her job. She'd probably do it. I was like, well, wow.
Wow.
So it was cool. Yeah.
That's great. Before we go back to our questions, if we can, Courtney, we talked about this. I teased it a little bit. Of course, we have you here tonight talking about all of your books, but the most recent one, The Cliffs, I've asked if you can read a passage for us and just share that, and then we'll jump back into the questions.
Okay, great. So this is the beginning of chapter 3, and maybe we'll talk about this after about the medium, but mediums play a big role in the book. And this is when Jane reluctantly, so Jane's mother has passed away, and Jane is at her mother's house, cleaning the house out, getting it ready to be sold. And her best friend has kind of tricked her into meeting with a medium who will connect her to her mother. And Jane is just not sure of this at all. Okay. The medium's name was Clementine. Of course it was, Jane thought. On the morning she was due to visit, Jane was awakened by the sound of her mother's dog, Walter, whining at 6 o'clock. This was the hardest part of every day now, waking up, remembering where she was and why. Walter was a 4-pound Pomeranian, an orange powder puff of a thing. Every time Jane looked at him, she was reminded of one of those fox stoles women wore draped over their shoulders in old movies. He shed constantly. His fur was everywhere. On her pants, on the sofa, on the rug, in clumps in the corners of every room, not 5 minutes after she had vacuumed. Her mother had doted on Walter, treated him better than she had her own children. Jane was pretty sure she loved him more, too. After dinner, her mother would lay the plates on the floor and let Walter lick them clean before putting them in the dishwasher. Jane remembered David one Easter, having to look away so he wouldn't gag. When Jane and David visited, her mother would say, "Jane, take your brother out, please." And Jane would say, "That dog is not my brother."
Okay. Interesting. Well, let's go right to the questions. Since we're talking about the medium, we have someone who I think I'm familiar with, Jill O'Malley. She asked the question, have you ever been to a medium, and what kind of research did you do when you wrote the part of the medium?
So I have indeed been to a medium many times. I started writing this book, as I said, in July of 2020. And my family, my husband and me and our kids and our dog, as I was reading that passage, I was like, that sounds like my house. It's full of dog hair. I guess that was the inspiration. But so we lived in New York for 20 years. And then at the start of COVID, like many New Yorkers with small children, we were like, okay, we got to go somewhere. Like, but you can't go to a playground. You can't take these kids anywhere. What are we going to do? And so we ended up spending a couple of months in suburban Albany, which was a very random location for us. We didn't know anyone there, but while we were there, a couple of the places where we could take our children that weren't closed off were the colonial era cemetery. And we would go there and have picnics, and they had a lovely duck pond. And the other place was the Shaker Village. So the original Shaker colony that Mother Ann founded was in Albany and now is a museum. And so, we were living, as everyone was at that time, this very like kind of small, isolated life. But I found myself going down these rabbit holes online and then in books about these different communities. And I remembered, particularly with the Shakers, that my mom had taken us to Sabbath Day Lake, Shaker Village in Maine when we were kids. And so when my kids were running around the Shaker Village, I was reading every little plaque and thinking about all of that. And the Shakers were spiritualists in their own way, which is sort of interesting. I think all the communities that are represented in this house and in this novel, they do have a lot of similarities, even though you may not immediately think so. At that same time, that same summer, I was reading a nonfiction book called The In-Betweens. And this is a book by my friend, Mira Patassin, who lives in Maine. And it's about Camp Etna, which is the real camp, the spiritualist camp that Camp Mira in the book is based on. I called it Camp Mira after Mira Patassin. She writes this wonderful nonfiction history of spiritualism in America, touching on, as I mentioned in the novel, the fact that around the time of the Civil War, spiritualism was really booming in America, and you had tens of thousands of people every summer. This was their summer vacation, was to go to a spiritualist camp and meet with mediums who would hopefully connect them with lost loved ones. And of course, at that time, you just had so many Americans who had lost young men in their lives and were not willing to sort of believe that that was the end of the story. I think in those early days of COVID, I mean, all of it is kind of a blur, I feel like, for all of us, but there was such a focus on mortality. And then I was spending all this time at a cemetery. That's where we were running around, and I was reading every old grave and sort of thinking about the lives that had been lived. And then when I read this book, in some ways I found it very comforting, the idea of a continued conversation with a lost loved one you never thought you'd get to speak to again. And I did end up, once the world opened back up, going with Mira to Camp Etna. And I've since been there a few times and met with some of the mediums there. And I did a lot of extremely fun research into mediums while I was writing this book. So I learned that there's something called evidential mediumship, which is the sort of medium who can provide you with hard evidence that they have your lost loved one there, some story or fact that only that person would know.
Oh, I like that.
I know, not generic, but really hard evidence. And there's actually even a place called the Windbridge Institute that certifies these mediums. There's very few of them who are Windbridge certified. And this is too long a story. I'll tell it in a really short way. But
Well, I've never been to a medium, so I'm fascinated by this.
okay. So I decided that I was like, okay, because I'm a researcher at heart, and I want to get to the bottom of this. So in a huge way, this book is about the kind of wrestling between faith and doubt and what do we believe. And when we lose people we love, or when life just doesn't make sense, sometimes we're willing to expand the boundaries of what we believe. And so I was thinking of all of that, and I thought, okay, I'm going to speak to a Windbridge certified medium. And in that way, the researcher in me was thinking, in that way, I will have proof. I will know for sure, because this is the best of the best. Because certainly there are mediums who are not the real deal, but I think some really are the real deal. So I found this medium named Janet No Havoc. I thought she was the perfect one for me. She was Windbridge certified. She was raised Catholic and had been a Catholic nun, and then left the abbey because she was, hearing voices of dead people, and that was not allowed there. And so she had started her own spiritualist church. And unlike some of the other Windbridge certified mediums who charge thousands of dollars for a reading and see celebrities and, exclusively see like Hollywood movie stars, she was very humble and was charging $200, which I thought was kind of reasonable. And just had this small church in New Jersey and whatever. So I called her office. I said I would like to schedule a reading with her. And they said, okay, great. It's a 2-year wait. So I was like, okay. So I knew I'd still be working on this book in 2 years. And I didn't tell them why I was inquiring, so it's like, okay, fine. I got on her wait list, and they told me the day before we will call to confirm. So I put it on the calendar for 2 years later. Don't think about it that much. And then a few months ahead of it, I saw it on the calendar, and I thought, oh yeah, that's coming up. And at that point, I began to imagine, what is she going to tell me? And I told myself this whole story about two people in my life who she would be connecting me with. I was positive. The closer we got, the more positive I was.
Wow.
And the day before the reading, I was very excited. I'm waiting for them to call me and confirm. And they don't call and they don't call. So we get to the end of the day and I'm thinking, this is weird. I hope they haven't forgotten me. And now I have to get on another 2-year wait list. So I called the office myself and I said, I just want to confirm this reading tomorrow. And the woman said, I'm so sorry, that's not going to be possible. Janet died last week.
Oh my God.
So my conduit to the dead had died. And I was like, now what do I do? I was so
Yeah.
bereft about this. And I feel like people in my life were so confused. They're like, just call another medium. And I'm like, no, because but this was
You were
instructive.
so invested. Yes.
This was instructive for me as far as the story went too, because I felt like, well, what is it when we meet with a medium? What are we really doing? And how much of that is about getting to spend time in our own minds, our own imaginations, our own hearts with somebody we've lost? And I had done that. I had spent many months thinking of people I hadn't thought of for a long time and imagining what they might have to tell me. And so in a way, I sort of got some approximation of that. But I have separately gone to Camp Etna and met with a couple of different mediums, one of whom I thought was really accurate, and the other was just dead wrong about everything.
Hmm. Wow, that's fascinating, intriguing. I haven't had the courage to do it, but maybe someday. Let's go to another question. Shifting gears a little bit from Sally, and there are over a dozen people that thumbs up on her question. She says she always likes to ask an author if there are any surprises as you wrote this novel, or any of your novels, characters going in a different direction that you didn't expect.
I mean, every single book is that way. Um, which is part of the fun of it in a way, although in the moment it can feel like frustration. But I think what I've learned over time is that, as a writer, I think my first novel, my second novel, maybe even my third novel, you're just like, okay, I want to finish this novel because it's a goal and you want to finish it. What I realized then is, well, the reward, if I'm lucky for finishing a novel, is I get to write another novel. So I will always be somewhere in that process, and there's no need to necessarily rush. And these, a lot of novelists I know and admired, they write outlines for their books. And to me, I don't really understand how that works because the way I write a novel is so much more, it feels a little woo-woo in the same vein as mediumship or something where like these characters do their own thing. And I'm always really surprised by what they do. I know I'm the one controlling them. I know I'm the one creating them. And yet I am often like, oh, I didn't know that person, knew that person, or, oh, or just a little side character suddenly announces themselves as, no, I'm actually going to be a main character. And it's like, oh, you are? All right, fine.
They
That has,
talk to you. It sounds like the characters, in a way, as they develop, they kind of speak to you.
yeah, it's weird, but yeah.
I like that.
So every book is like that. And that's the most fun part because I always think I know what it's going to be and then it goes somewhere else.
Right. I do want to talk a little bit in a minute about your process and, like you mentioned, outline. But before that, just this question is a little out there. It's an anonymous person asking the question, but I kind of like it. It's fun. You mentioned your book club. My book club is reading The Cliffs for October, and I'm hosting. What suggestions do you have for enhancing our event? Food, decorations, discussion, topics, etc.
Oh, I love that. That's so good. I mean, I think if you really want to go all out, you should invite a medium,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
One of the things we did when the book came out, my publisher did a sweepstakes with Reese's book club that you enter the sweepstakes and a medium will call in to your book club and speak to any person who wants to speak to her because many mediums do readings over the phone. So I thought that was a very cool idea. Otherwise, I don't know, if you want to keep it a little more low key, you could do like a Maine themed, maybe some whoopie pies or something, it's just a very different, different
Hmm.
vibe, or you could do both of those things. Um, Some book clubs have told me in honor of Jane and her drinking problem, they have done mocktails, and that's been exciting, like a signature
Sober
mocktail.
curious thing. Yeah,
Right.
that's a good idea.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, along those lines, let's stick with that topic. Lisa Weber asked, since being a Reese Witherspoon book club pick, have you met Reese and have the sales of your books increased? She's asking, and there are a few questions there.
So Reese Witherspoon actually optioned my third novel, The Engagements, for film. A film that unfortunately never got made, but through that process, I got to know her, and she was so lovely and personable. I had lunch with her several times in New York and in LA, and would text with her, and she was just very like a real book lover, which is so nice. I mean, I think in Hollywood, there aren't a lot of people who read long, dense novels, but she does. She really does read all these books, and she really
Wow.
have a passion for books. And I think, right now she's kind of one of a few people really like giving the industry a boost, because not only does she have a book every month that she's promoting, but she's also always talking about other books as well. And my last book, I was very lucky, was Jenna Bush pick for the Today Show book club. And she's also just like incredibly passionate about reading, and in such a genuine way. Um,
I
and
think you have to be, though, in a way, don't you?
Exactly. Otherwise,
Yeah.
you wouldn't jump on this ship necessarily. But yeah, it's just such a lovely thing to have that. So with the Jenna's book club, I don't know about Reese's book club yet because I'm new to that group. But with Jenna's book club, she brings all of the authors. We all come every year for her anniversary of the book club to the Today Show. And so we all get to see each other, and it's so lovely. It's like such a nice group of people. And yeah, we're all very sort of bonded by that, which is nice.
That is nice. Well, we have another question here from a woman, Allison McGuire. She says, "Hi, Courtney, fellow Smithy here. I'm I'm wondering how you approach research for your books. I'm always so impressed by the level of historically accurate detail you achieve." Now, I know earlier when we started, you had mentioned you were a researcher, so I guess that's in your wheelhouse.
Yeah.
But not all novelists do as much research, and you certainly have intense research in your novels.
So I love, 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 love doing research. And yeah, I started out as a researcher for two of the opinion columnists at the New York Times. So it was Bob Herbert and Gail Collins. And my job was to do all the research and to also make sure every fact was correct. And I still approach any bit of historical information I put in a novel, even though I know it's a novel, I approach it in that same way. It's funny because I've written a lot of op-eds for the Times since leaving the Times now 15 years ago. And when I work with an editor who doesn't know me, they'll sometimes be like, "Oh, it's a novelist." So they triple check your facts because they're afraid you're gonna, go a little rogue with the facts. And they always say to me, "Wow, you don't write like a novelist. You write more like a journalist." And I take that as a compliment.
Compliment, yes.
So the research in this book was really, really a lot of fun. And it ties back to another book of mine, The Engagements, the one that Reese Witherspoon bought. The Engagements, one of the main characters is Frances Garrity, who was a real woman. I would call her an honorary Smithy to my fellow Smithy out there. She wrote the line, "A diamond is forever," for De Beers in, I think, 1942. It was in the 1940s. And she worked for an ad agency called NW Air. And she always felt that she did not really get her due because she was working in such a male dominated time and place. I met the woman who took over for Frances in 1970, Deanne Dunning, who was fascinating and became one of my dearest friends. And The Cliffs is dedicated to Deanne Dunning and also to Donna Loring, the Penobscot tribal elder I mentioned.
Yes.
And when I was writing that book, I went and did research at the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe, which, of course, if you've read The Cliffs, you know is where Jane works. And that's an archive of women in America. And they have such an incredible array of stuff. They have, the papers of Julia Child and Amelia Earhart, but also of thousands of women none of us have heard of before. And one of those women was Dorothy Dignam, who had been Frances Garrity's predecessor at the ad agency and was writing copy for De Beers during World War One. So if you think about, Mad Men and the idea that that was the first time women existed in advertising, no, it wasn't. So I wanted to, ever since going and researching at the Schlesinger, I desperately wanted to include it in a book. And I think for me, when I'm writing fiction, I'm always sort of thinking about this central idea that women are very much a product of their historical moment, and that the moment a woman is born will determine so much of who she's allowed to become. And so I think the Schlesinger is really on the same wavelength. That's something that they're always looking at as well. They're also always trying to tell, working so hard to tell a more diverse and complete version of American women's history. So yes, so that's kind of how this particular one came to be. And then I think most of my research begins with a ton of reading because I don't even know what I don't know yet. And then going firsthand and finding the real people to talk to and to get to know.
Those two people that you said you researched were Bob and Gail Collins. What do they say about you now and all of the books you've written?
They're the best. They're seriously the best. When I was still their assistant, my novel Commencement came out, and then my second novel, Maine, I wrote about half of it before I quit my day job there. And they threw me the most wonderful book party. They couldn't have been more lovely. I mean, these are people who are really like, they're famous. The first time I walked down the street with Bob Herbert, it was like all these people were saying, Bob Herbert, Bob Herbert. And I was like, wow, you're a celebrity. I didn't really realize this. And so, I felt like it was just such an incredible thing that they were so generous and lovely about that. And
Great.
yeah.
That's great. Couple of quick questions I'm curious about. Do you have a time that you write every day in the morning or the evening? And then there's someone that asked a question about what advice do you have for someone who's writing their first novel?
So I am terrible. I don't know how my books get written because I'm so undisciplined about when I write. And I find like every book I've written is very much kind of a time capsule of what I was doing or going through at that time, And so I wrote each of them in a different way for that reason. So when I had a full-time job, I could only write Commencement at night and on the weekends, and often I was keeping the spirit of that book alive by writing on Post-it notes or dry cleaning receipts that I would grab out of my purse. I'd have a little idea and I would, grab a pen and write something down and shove it in my purse. And then on Saturday mornings, I would literally clean out my purse and take every little piece of paper and try to decipher what I meant by the notes I had written myself. So it's kind of leaving myself this little trail of breadcrumbs. And now I still do that, but in a slightly more evolved way. I'm still really into Post-its, which most people in my life laugh at me about because I if I lose a Post-it, I'm completely lost. But I also just send myself emails, and I use the same subject line. So when I was writing, for example, my book Friends and Strangers, I started writing it when my son was a newborn, but I, of course, didn't actually write for like the first 6 months he was alive. But it was partly about a woman with a newborn. And so I wanted to make sure I wrote down everything that I was experiencing and wanted to include. And so I just started this email thread to myself under the subject line babysitter. And every time I had a thought for that book, I would just write an email that said babysitter and email myself the thought. And 6 months, after he was born, I sat down and put all of these emails into a document. And that was sort of the beginning, the breadcrumbs of that book. And so I think when you do have other demands on your time, which everyone does, there's something I saw. I wish I remember what the quote was, because I saw this piece of art in someone's home on Instagram, and it basically said something along the lines of, art is the one thing no one is ever going to ask you to do. So at this stage of my life, I don't have a day job anymore. This is my job, which is wonderful. But I have a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old. I have a 14-year-old dog. There are so many things every day that happen that
Get in the way, I'm sure,
oh
right?
my gosh. And it's crazy because I feel like unless you're in this crazy stage of life or have experienced it, it's hard to explain like what do I do all day? But now the day goes by and it's like I produce nothing. So a lot of my writing I do late at night after my kids go to bed. And I feel like most writers, unless they have a trust fund, they do start out with a job and they have to write around the parameters of that job. And so a lot of writers begin either writing early in the morning before everyone gets up. That's most women writers I know, or late night. That's me, after everyone's gone to bed. And I think now I still write in that fashion, even though in theory I have the whole day to do it.
Right. I usually write in the morning because I'm fresh. I'm tired at night. We only have like 3 minutes left, believe it or not. This has been so much fun. There's one quick question from, I'm not sure who it's from, but she says, I learned so much while reading The Cliffs. Was the description of the cove and the cliff walk based on a gunkwit? Also, it was a treat to get the references to Dave Dinger Ford and Route 1 in Saugus. Oh, that was from Susan Adler. Sorry, Susan. Thank you.
I love it. I forgot there's a Dave Dinger Ford reference. Oh, that's great. It's so funny. I remember so many. I mean, we could do a whole other hour on Zoom over this about
I
just like
know.
jingles that you remember from your childhood.
Yes.
The man that oh, that's another story. I'll tell you that one later. Anyway, to answer this question, yes, it's very much based on a gunkwit. It's a gunkwit, but
How do you pronounce the town? Because I kept trying to pronounce it as I was reading it every time.
I must tell you, so it's pronounced Awadapquit. I
Oh,
wanted to tell you that my mom read an early version of this book when I was still making changes to it. She probably read it in September or October. And she, maybe a month later, we're talking about Christmas. What's everybody want for Christmas? And my mother said, all I want for Christmas is for you to change the name of that town because it's impossible to pronounce. And I should have listened to her because I didn't change it. And everyone's like, how do you say this? What is this?
Adapt quit. Yes,
I
yes.
changed it because I I love a gunkwit so much. Um, and when I was writing this book, one of the first things that sort of struck my interest as I researched the indigenous part of the story was that when you go to a gunkwit, the motto of the town is a beautiful place by the sea, and the story is that is a gunkwit means that in the Abenaki language. What I subsequently read was that it's kind of interesting how a lot of towns in New England have these indigenous definitions that are very tourist friendly and specific to beauty, because that wouldn't have necessarily been how places were named. And there was a whole faction of people who say that there's no way a gunkwit could mean that it is a made up word. And so I included that in the book, and I actually think that is true. But then ultimately, the researcher in me, I need to make sure if I'm making an accusation like that, I need to make sure it is 100% ironclad true. And there was just a little bit of me that wasn't totally sure. And so I thought, you know, I'm not going to slander the name of a gunkwit, a place that I love. So I'm just going to change the name, but everyone knows that this is about a gunkwit.
Right. I kind of gathered that too. All right, we are at our last question, Courtney. And I'm going to go with a combination of two. What are you writing now and your thoughts on your next book? A couple of people put that in there.
I'm writing a book now that is set in Scituate, Massachusetts. So finally coming to my home state. And
Hooray.
we'll see. It's so far it's very, very character driven and doesn't have any research in it, which feels like I'm cheating or feels wrong. So I'm gonna have to add some element of research to it. But so far I'm in the very early stages of it. But it's kind of a family driven, character based novel, much less research heavy than this last one.
All right. Well, we look forward to a book coming on Scituate. It's about time we have to wrap everything up. Thank you, Courtney, for a great conversation. I enjoyed it. It's such a pleasure to meet you and to hear about your process in writing. And thank you, everyone, for joining me tonight in this conversation. Thank you for all your questions, to KPO4 Book Group for writing in questions. Thank you all again. Courtney, it was so great to meet you. Thank you.
You too. Thank you.
Okay, and everybody keep reading and have a wonderful evening.